Welcome to another deep dive. Have you ever stopped to wonder what really happens when old enemies suddenly become new allies?
Mm.
Especially, when political power is on the line.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're plunging into a story from Spanish history that's it's packed with surprising shifts, deep contradictions, and it's a real reminder of how flexible, maybe how negotiable principles can actually be.
That's absolutely right. Our focus for this deep dive is Spanish fascism, not just its traditional enemies, but its really quite unexpected modern alliances, specifically with evangelical Protestantism.
Wow, okay.
We're basing our discussion mainly on a pretty revealing source, the Devil's Pact, evangelical paradox in Spanish fascism.
Right. And what we want for you, our listener, is to come away with a hopefully crystal clear picture of this complex ideological journey,
Mm-hmm.
the old hatreds, the history, and what really drove these almost unbelievable shifts.
Exactly.
It's a deep dive into what happens when core beliefs, these long-held doctrines, they just become bargaining chips in the power game.
The game of power, yeah.
So to really get this, we need to step back a bit. Picture Spain's far right, okay? A movement really steeped in what they call national Catholicism. For ages, they had a pretty clear list of enemies.
Oh, yeah, very clear.
Who were they? And, what was behind all that animosity?
For the sort of guardians of national Catholicism, the traditional enemies were really cemented in history. You had Masonry, communism, Jews. Those were the big ones.
The usual suspects for that kind of ideology.
Right, but, and this is often overlooked, Protestants were consistently resented too. They weren't just seen as a different religion.
What was that?
Oh, yeah. They were viewed as like a political and cultural sickness infecting Europe.
And the roots of that resentment are deep, aren't they? Goes back to the Reformation, 16th century, the wars of religion, the whole shebang.
Absolutely. All of that laid the groundwork. But the bitterness, the really deep stuff, that became almost existential much later on.
When was that?
The real historical sting came from watching the rise of the big Protestant powers. England, the Netherlands, later the United States, happening at the exact same time the Spanish Empire, once so dominant, was visibly declining. And this left behind what the Spanish call rancor. It's like a really deep, lingering resentment or bitterness. It seriously shaped Spain's identity and how it viewed Protestants, almost like an existential threat.
Okay, so that's the historical backdrop, deep-seated rancor. But then, just when this seems totally set in stone, something shifts. This German sociologist, Max Weber, his ideas come into play. How does that happen?
Yeah, it's a fascinating twist. Weber's big work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism from 1905, it kind of became this unexpected weapon in their ideological arsenal.
How so?
Well, Weber's core idea, put simply, was that certain values from the Reformation, especially Calvinism, actually helped legitimize making money. Accumulating wealth could even be seen as a sign of God's favor, a sign you were chosen.
That sounds like a huge mental shift. I mean, how different was that from earlier Christian ideas about money? Or even what the early reformers were saying?
Oh, it was massive. A really profound change within certain Protestant groups. Remember, early Christianity often saw loving money as sinful. And even the Reformation itself started partly as a critique of the Catholic Church's perceived greed, like selling indulgences.
Right, the corruption.
Exactly. Weber highlighted how, for some Protestants, that view of wealth got reevaluated.
Okay, so Weber provides this new lens on Protestantism and capitalism. How did the Spanish fascists then grab onto that and, quiffed it?
They absolutely jumped on it. The Spanish fascists and other reactionaries who, let's be honest, weren't exactly living in poverty themselves, but loved to present themselves as spiritually pure. They saw Weber's work as, intellectual ammo for their prejudice. They basically used him as proof that Protestants were behind the most dehumanized capitalism. In their narrative, they sort of lumped Protestants in with greedy Jews, a really nasty, prejudiced caricature.
Wow. So they paint themselves as the good guys, not driven by money, while accusing Protestants of being greedy capitalists. But what was the actual reality? What were their economic practices like?
Well, the reality, as a source digs into, was let's just say, starkly different from their rhetoric.
I bet.
Deep corruption, rampant greed, and crucially, they actively maintained economic inequalities in Spain, social structures that felt almost medieval.
Really? Medieval?
Yeah, this system massively favored the upper classes, the landowners, the aristocracy, and it stuck around largely unchanged even when Spain became a democracy later on. So their whole act about spiritual purity and not caring about wealth, utter hypocrisy, the irony is just thick.
It really is.
Yeah.
And speaking of contradictions, you mentioned Spanish fascism wasn't just one single thing, especially under Franco, right?
Yeah.
1939 to 75. It wasn't monolithic.
Not even close. It was, well, a constantly shifting landscape. Take the 1940s, for instance. The Falange, that's the sort of original Spanish fascist party, they were running the economy.
Okay.
And they brought in these autarkic corporatist policies, basically aiming for self-sufficiency, organizing the economy around guilds.
Which sounds almost left-wing.
Structurally, yeah, surprisingly close to socialist or even communist ideas in some ways, but always, always wrapped up in super ultra-Catholic language. Franco himself, who wasn't exactly an economic genius,
Understatement.
he went along with it.
Yeah.
And the result, national ruin, widespread poverty, just drove the country into the ground.
So the spiritually pure regime tanks the economy. Makes sense. If it was that bad, how did they get out of it? How did they pivot?
Well, the pivot wasn't really their idea. It was driven from outside, after Spain signed military pacts with the U.S. in 1953.
Cold War politics.
Exactly. A new group pushed the Phalangists aside. These were technocrats from Opus Dei, the powerful conservative Catholic lay organization.
Right. Opus Dei.
They came in and introduced a capitalist model, much more in line with what their new American allies wanted, completely changed Spain's economic trajectory.
And even within the Falange itself, you said there was diversity. Not everyone marching to the same drumbeat.
Not at all. Take Ramiro Ledesma. He was one of the founders, right? But he was a key figure for the more socialist, even atheist Phalangists.
Atheist Phalangists, interesting.
Yeah. And today, he's still kind of the only Spanish reference point for some Spanish neo-Nazis. They often ignore the other big fascist leaders, sometimes see them as sellouts.
So different factions even then.
Definitely. Alongside the main national Catholic extreme, you had these atheist or nihilistic types trying to copy German Nazism. Some even followed Strasserism.
Strasserism, what's that?
It was a sort of left-wing Nazi ideology, more focused on workers, anti-capitalist in a way, different from the mainstream Nazism that eventually allied with big business. It shows you just how varied and often contradictory these currents were. It wasn't simple.
Okay, so fast forward. What does all this history mean for Spain now? Despite all the changes, the move to capitalism, democracy, do any of those old characteristics, maybe those feudal echoes you mentioned, still linger?
It's quite striking, actually, because yes, even with all the modernization, Spain still has these shadows of its past. It remains one of the Western countries with, well, pretty high social inequality. And a huge informal economy, cash in hand stuff.
Heavy land.
Still a big issue. Land ownership, especially down south, still concentrated in the hands of a few big landowners, aristocrats. So they're railing against foreign greed while presiding over massive domestic corruption, a huge shadow economy. Spain had and still has one of the highest inequality rates in Europe.
It's a stark contrast, the anti-greed talk versus the reality on the ground.
Yeah.
The sources do mention one interesting exception, though, a sort of localized difference in the southeast.
Yes, that's the Almeria and Murcia region. It's kind of an economic anomaly today, with huge incomes from greenhouses. But its origins are actually in a Falangist project back in the 1970s. They tried to divide up semi-desert land into small plots, creating small-scale, highly productive capitalist farmers.
It created these pockets of localized wealth, prosperity, that really defied the typical rural stagnation.
So you get the success story, ironically, born from state-directed intervention during the dictatorship itself.
So a different model from the biggest states.
Completely different. And it was an economic success in contrast to the traditional aristocratic structures elsewhere. And interestingly, it's a region with very strong ultra-right voting patterns today. And the sources argue this isn't an accident. It's a direct result of Spain historically being resistant to the kind of democratic, egalitarian reforms, land reform, constitutional changes that happened elsewhere in Europe over the centuries.
So they kind of missed out on those big shifts.
To a large extent, yes. Spain held onto many of its older, almost feudal structures much longer. It resisted the kind of wealth redistribution that often came with democratic revolutions. This locked in huge disparities, massive estates for a few, while many others struggled.
And that has knock-on effects, I imagine.
Absolutely. It leads to other big problems, like severe rural depopulation. If there are no jobs or decent services in the countryside because, frankly, neither the state nor private companies see much profit there, people just leave for the cities.
Which just reinforces the existing power imbalances and inequalities.
Exactly. It's a cycle. And then there's this other concept the sources mention, corporativism. It sounds quite specific to Spain. What's that about?
Yeah, corporativism in this context is interesting. It refers to a system inherited, really, from the old medieval Catholic guilds. It's more than just a modern trade union.
Okay.
It's like these deeply embedded blocks where people in the same profession or trade band together, often with political backing, to protect their own interests very strongly. The sources talk about how these groups can create closed shops, enforce silence like the Omerta, to shield members from outside criticism or competition.
So like protecting their own, almost like a mafia, as the source hinted? That's the comparison used, yeah. Examples given include how hard it can be to sue doctors for negligence, or how certain professional groups have fought tooth and nail, sometimes using pretty aggressive tactics, against laws they didn't like. It creates this insular environment protecting privileges. And historically, remember, those original Catholic guilds explicitly bar foreigners, people of other religions, even Jewish converts, from joining. So there's a long history of exclusion baked in.
Okay, so we have this complex picture. Old hatreds, the far right's own hypocrisies about money, plus these deep societal inequalities and protective systems in Spain, it feels like. Like fertile ground for something new to take root, maybe? A big shift, perhaps one that started gaining momentum elsewhere first?
That's a perfect way to put it. This backdrop in Spain, the social rigidity, the needs not being met, it finds a really strong echo, and maybe even a trigger for change when we look across the Atlantic to Hispano-America and Brazil.
What was happening there?
Just explosive growth of evangelical Christianity. I mean, really dramatic growth over the last few decades. It started seriously challenging the Catholic Church's dominance, which had seemed unbreakable for centuries.
A huge religious shift.
Huge. And it wasn't just religious. It profoundly impacted politics, society, everything.
And why was the Catholic Church losing ground so dramatically? Did it have its own issues that kind of opened the door?
Absolutely. The sources really emphasize this. The traditional Catholic Church in Hispano-America was often seen, fairly or unfairly, as failing to connect with the real, pressing social problems of the poor and disadvantaged.
Too close to the elites, maybe.
That was the perception, yeah. Offering spiritual solace, but maybe not enough practical help or advocacy on issues like poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, even movements within the church like liberation theology.
Right. The Jesuits were involved there, weren't they?
Yes, driven largely by Jesuits trying to blend faith with social justice. But even they faced pushback from within the church hierarchy, suspicion from the Vatican, and they struggled to create widespread, lasting change on the ground. So they couldn't really stop the evangelical wave.
Why were the evangelicals connecting so effectively then?
The sources suggest they often offered more direct community support, a stronger sense of belonging, maybe a clearer path to personal improvement or social uplift for people feeling left behind by the traditional structures.
And there's a weird historical twist with the Jesuits mentioned in the sources, right?
Yeah.
Something about fascism.
Yes, it's a really striking irony that underlines how much things can change. The same Jesuit order, some elements of which had, believe it or not, shown some support for aspects of fascism back in the 1930s, maybe seeing it as a way to impose order and morality, later became some of fascism's sharpest critics. Because around the same time, the Franco regime was pivoting towards Opus Dei technocrats and capitalism. The Catholic world itself was fighting this huge internal ideological battle. Liberation theology, championed by progressive Jesuits people like Ignacio Ellacuría, who was tragically murdered for his work in El Salvador in '89.
What was their focus?
Their focus was on empowering the poor, social justice, sometimes even supporting revolutionary change against oppressive regimes. It was a very different vision of Catholicism's role.
And how did the Spanish National Catholics react to that?
They didn't champion the progressives, that's for sure. They sided completely with the conservative line coming from the Vatican under Pope John Paul II, which actively worked to repress liberation theology.
So another example of prioritizing political alignment, whether it's with conservative Rome or capitalist Washington, over maybe internal consistency or siding with the marginalized.
Precisely. It shows a consistent pattern.
Yeah.
Choose the powerful ally, stick with the established power structures.
But the economic hypocrisy of the ruling class meant that the ideological space for an anti-capitalist, yet still far-right critique was always there, lingering beneath the surface.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. By the late 20th century, the Spanish far-right has already kind of sold its economic soul, right?
Yeah.
The Opus Dei technocrats to American geopolitical needs. They're hypocrites on economics, maybe, but they remain pretty steadfastly national Catholic in their cultural stance. And now enter the new wave. Global evangelicalism. And the sources are really clear that this rapid growth translated directly into political muscle through organized networks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is where the dynamic shifts away from pure theology and into mobilization into politics. Many of these evangelical sects, particularly the ones imported or heavily influenced by the U.S. Bible Belt, they've developed these sophisticated, sometimes highly coercive political networks. They gain power through block voting, getting their communities to vote en masse, and sometimes through outright corruption, leveraging their votes for political favors, state support, getting laws passed that favor them, always with ultra-right parties. It's an incredibly effective political machine.
And this wave, largely American in origin, hyper-capitalist in its outlook, gets imported pretty much wholesale into Spain. And here is where the paradox just becomes completely ridiculous, doesn't it? They brought a whole package, theology, culture, political leanings.
And here's the kicker, the real paradox. This imported evangelical movement,
Yeah.
it represents so much of what the traditional Spanish far-right claim to despise, historically speaking.
Exactly. That's the core of it. By definition, they're Protestant, the historical enemy number one. Many are aggressively pro-capitalist, seeing wealth as that sign of divine favor, just like Weber talked about.
The very thing the Spanish reactionaries used Weber to condemn.
Precisely. And maybe most jarringly, many are intensely pro-Israel, but for their own specific, fundamentalist Christian reasons related to biblical prophecy in the end times.
Which would clash pretty hard with traditional Catholic views and maybe even some older far-right anti-Semitic currents.
Absolutely. And their brand of fundamentalism, as the sources note, is often so extreme on social issues, on political rhetoric, that it makes those old-school Catholic fascists look almost, well, moderate in comparison.
Okay, this is it. The evangelical paradox fully emerges. You've got Group A, the Spanish far right, steeped in national Catholicism, centuries of hating Protestantism, and Group B, these rising U.S. influence evangelicals, Protestant, capitalist, pro-Israel, logically, historically, theologically. They should be bitter enemies.
Yeah, I would think absolutely yes, based on everything they've ever said, every principle they supposedly stood for. Especially the Spanish far right's deep-seated anti-Protestantism. Any kind of alliance seems completely unthinkable, irreconcilable differences.
But that's not what happened. Against all logic, against all history, the Spanish far right didn't just tolerate them, they actively welcomed them, opened the doors.
Astonishingly, yes. They've embraced them, sought their support, formed alliances.
But what on earth is going on? Why? Why this impossible turnaround? What changed?
The answer, when you piece it together from the sources, is actually quite simple, but incredibly revealing about what truly motivates them.
Okay.
They found a common enemy, an enemy they both perceived as so dangerous, so threatening to their entire worldview, that it completely wiped out centuries of religious dogma, historical conflict, everything.
A common enemy powerful enough to make Protestants and national Catholics allies. Who or what is this enemy?
It's a shared, intense hatred for a cluster of modern ideas. Secularism, feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, left-wing politics in general, even pacifism.
The culture war targets.
Exactly. These are the things they both see as undermining traditional values, natural order, God's law, however they frame it. It's the shared perception of a massive cultural and political threat that allowed them to build a bridge across that huge historical chasm.
This really lays it bare, doesn't it? It suggests that for the Spanish far right, at least, ideology wasn't the core belief. It was just a tool.
That's precisely the conclusion the sources point towards. Ideology was always secondary. The hatred of Protestantism, a cornerstone of their identity for ages, it was useful until it wasn't.
So the moment a Protestant group became a useful ally.
For winning elections, for gaining power, for fighting this new war against secularism and the left. All that history, all that doctrine just got tossed aside, without hesitation.
It's pretty stark proof, then. When the only real goal is power, any principle, no matter how supposedly sacred or foundational, is up for grabs.
Absolutely. It shows a kind of ruthless pragmatism hiding behind the mask of unwavering conviction. Power trumps principle every time, it seems.
Wow. What a journey we've taken. From those deep historical hatreds and the far right's own hypocrisies about money, through Spain's specific social issues, landing on this just stunning alliance, driven entirely by shared political enemies, not shared beliefs.
And understanding this paradox, it really gives you a lens to look at political shifts everywhere, not just Spain. It shows how easily long-held narratives, historical grudges can be flipped or just ignored when power, elections, and fighting a perceived cultural enemy become the main drivers.
It's a powerful reminder that what people say they believe isn't always the real motivation, is it?
Not by a long shot. What's said and what's done can be worlds apart when political expediency kicks in.
Absolutely. It really makes you think, doesn't it? If these groups can discard a fundamental enemy like Protestantism today because it's politically useful,
Yeah.
it leaves you wondering, and maybe this is the final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Who gets labeled the enemy tomorrow?
Indeed. That's the unsettling question, isn't it?
It is. We'll leave you with that thought. See you next time on The Deep Dive.